Hello everyone, this is Alex Canby and I'm going to be reading you all a little excerpt from my novel that I've been working on, The Boy Behind the Curtain. I have been working on this book for quite some time and this will be my first real public reading of the first 3 chapters. I'm currently traveling across the US and I've made my way to Duluth, Minnesota to visit a friend of mine. I'm going to be here for about a week, and then I'm going to be heading back down south to Florida, where I will hopefully learn to sail, and then that will take me down to South America, hopefully by sailboat. Anyways, I'm just kind of getting everything set up, making sure people can hear me. Let me see here. The screen is black for a reason. I don't want any distractions really, and there's no real need for you all to see me, not while I'm reading. I do have a piece of tape over it, so I will wave at you all for a brief moment before I tape it back up. Okay, I'm going to check to see if everything else is working, and then we're going to get this thing started. Yeah, and I apologize for the late start. I had some Wi-Fi connectivity issues, so anyways. Alright, looks like people can hear me, everything's working. And let me open the file. Okay, here we go. So, alright. Once again, the title of my book is The Boy Behind the Curtain, and this is Chapter 1, The Evening Star. Happily ever after, Katie whispered, her voice warm and dreamlike. It's what I've always wanted. Leaning forward, she pressed the button for the 9th floor. Gravity shifted as the elevator began to climb. Caleb turned to look at the young girl standing next to him. The wide, green, jeweled eyes seemed lost in a distance beyond the closing elevator doors. The curious upward curve still clung to the edges of her full pink lips. As a little girl, I desperately sought a window into that world, she continued, to understand how the characters of my stories lived once their trials were over. Caleb's eyes wandered as he listened. Her hair had been dyed back to its original shade of golden brown, with highlighted streaks of sunshine blonde. Odd little holes punctuated her nose, lip, ear, and eyebrow, where her piercings had been just days ago. And when I looked to the adults for answers, she continued, I discovered most of the people don't really want a happy ending. They say they do, they pretend they do, but people don't really want paradise. What they really want is a promised land they can pine for. The elevator came to a stop and the doors opened into an empty, air-conditioned hallway. And for a reason to justify their suffering. Katie held out her hand and Caleb took it, following her out down the long, patterned corridor of carpets, lights, and doors. He watched her delicate 19-year-old body move ahead of him with a graceful air, the light blue sundress playing such an odd contrast against the dark and revealing clothing she usually wore. Katie slowed and stopped outside a door where the music and voices hummed through the hallway. She turned to him for the first time, and her smile widened. But you've shown me that it doesn't have to be that way. Her eyes glistened as she stared into him. So thank you. Caleb was at a loss for words. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears as her eyelids slowly closed and she leaned forward to press her lips softly against his own. The pressure of her breasts and mouth against him made him flush, and Caleb felt filled by the warm bliss that swam through his chest, neck, and face. He had thought she was lost to him, but it seemed his fears were misplaced. With her eyes still closed, Katie leaned back ever so slightly and whispered, "There's nothing to be afraid of." Caleb's eyes wandered over her fair skin, observing the light freckles that spattered her nose and cheeks. Again she whispered, even quieter this time, "There's nothing to be afraid of." Watching her breathe the soft words, he wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. Her face remained less than an inch from his own, and her mouth opened to take in a long, deep breath before speaking the words one final time. "There's nothing to be afraid of." After the third incantation, she stepped back, opened her eyes, and smiled a radiant smile. Her glowing serenity filled him with a sense of joy, but on the periphery of his awareness there was a touch of unease that stirred in his stomach. She turned away from him and opened the door behind her. Inside, the apartment held a small crowd that greeted them with confused expressions as they entered. Caleb was all but ignored as those who knew Katie gawked at her appearance. Against the wall to their left was a line of shoes where everyone in attendance had neatly placed their footwear. Caleb slid his off and added them to the end of the line, but turned to see that Katie had forgone the courtesy and stepped into the party with her silver flats still attached to her feet. The studio apartment was warm and alive with the sound of music, talk, and a television laugh track. The space was clean and comfortable, and the people were jovial, but the setting did nothing to assuage the growing sense of unease in Caleb's gut. As Katie began to mingle, having seemingly forgotten about him in the wash of adoration. By the ages and demeanors of the 20-odd people in the apartment, he guessed most of them were Katie's college classmates. And while only cursory glances were given in Caleb's direction, the heads of males and females alike turned to take Katie in. From the far edge of the couch, where Caleb placed himself, he watched her weave from one grouping to the next, as if nothing could be more natural, as if this was where she had always belonged. Her presence was met with smiles and surprise by those who knew her, and in her wake she left only gossip and confusion. Caleb could see their discomfort, and beneath it, their envy. As she once again passed from one huddle of people to the next, her eyes met with his, and her serene smile shone again. Whereas he would have expected such a look to fill him with delight, he was surprised when a sudden anxiety thrummed in his chest. But he turned away from the feeling and smiled in return. As the horizon swept slowly up to meet the evening sun, people continued to arrive. Caleb watched the guests interacting from the edge of the room with a certain detachment. Outside of Katie, there was nothing new happening here. Then came a moment when he was snapped from his apathy and realized he'd lost track of her. Everyone around him was occupied in drink, talk, or television. He turned his head slowly, not wanting to call attention to his search, but his eyes scanned wildly. He found her standing alone in front of a sliding glass door that led out onto a small balcony. He lowered his head and sat facing away, but only so far that he could still keep her clearly within the edge of his vision. Katie bent down and slipped off the first of her silver flats, then the other. Something stirred inside him, like a serpent coiling in his stomach. The sliding glass door opened with a hush and closed behind her just as quietly. With a quick glance, Caleb could tell that no one else had taken note of her absence. Through the glass, he could see the buildings and towering trees of the city as dark outlines in the fading skylight. When she stepped further out onto the balcony, leaving the warm light of the studio apartment, she too became a shadow, another silhouette against the deep blue dusk. Her head was raised, searching through the clear twilight. From where he sat, he could see the solitary shining star that caught her gaze. And then Katie closed her eyes, and he saw her lips moving, speaking secret words into the ether. But Caleb knew it was not a star, and it was not shining, not really. It was Venus, reflecting the light of the sun, and whatever wish she might be making, it would not come true. His eyes refocused on the sliding glass door, and he saw the facade of the bright and lively room mirrored around her silhouette. The people at the party appeared to move and live within the backdrop of the darkening world outside that window. and he could see through it all. Katie glanced briefly back into the apartment, and Caleb quickly dropped his gaze, but managed to keep her in the corner of his vision. Barefoot, she carefully lifted one leg, then the other, to sit facing outward on the railing. A physical pressure swelled inside his chest and weighed on his shoulders. Her hair and dress were caught in a gentle wind, pressing them against one side of her delicate frame. His eyes were dry for want of tears, and his teeth clenched together. Her shoulders rose with a deep inhale, her head tilted back and her eyes closed as she exhaled. He groped for some words to cry out, to stand, to run, but he had no voice and no strength. Her hands let go, and Katie leaned forward and fell out of sight. A profound silence settled inside him. The cry he had been fighting to find was dead. His jaw relaxed and his dry eyes blinked. He let his long-held breath escape through his mouth, and his body trembled. Slowly he became aware of the inane chatter from the other people in the room. There had been no screams, no gasps or shrieks from those lounging comfortably around him. It was surreal to hear someone laugh in the kitchen, and it only added to the emptiness spreading inside him. They had seen nothing, they had felt nothing. They were at ease in the midst of peril. He allowed himself to turn and face the sliding glass door full on. This time he saw nothing of the party. This time all he could see was his own dim, translucent reflection, frozen in that thin pane. The short brown curls of hair that hung around the edges of his youthful face, outlining the smooth, pallid complexion, and his own wide, dark eyes staring back at him. Caleb could not have said how much time had passed before the muffled scream found its way into the apartment. It was nearly a whisper against the chatter and music, but one young man standing near the balcony turned in curiosity. Just as he pulled the door open, another faraway scream cut through the air, full of terror and anguish. This time more turned and followed the young man out into the early night. "Jesus fucking Christ, is that?" were the only words spoken before the panic struck. Caleb rose from the couch in a stupor and made his way over. Several of the young men stared down in horror, and a few of the girls had begun to sob, grabbing on to the closest person they could find. Caleb did not go out onto the balcony as the others did. Instead, he stopped outside the glass door, reached down to pick up the silver shoes. Clutching them tightly against his chest, he took in what remained of Katie's warmth. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Now I'm going to get a drink of water, and we will move on to Chapter 2. I apologize if there are any rough spots. This is still a work in progress, but you're getting the gist of it at this point in its creation. So let's see, where does Chapter 2 start? Here we go. Okay. So Chapter 2 is called The Wolf and the Woodsman. Daniel Teely sat alone, hunched behind the desk at the front of his classroom, staring at his phone. He read the text message again. "I'll be by to pick up my things on Saturday afternoon. There's nothing else to talk about." It had been nearly 2 days since Ashley had sent him that text, and it would be a whole day until he would see her. The weight felt intolerable, especially here in his empty classroom. His students had become a balm against the pain, and the breaks between periods had become the hardest part of his day of late. He closed his messages and opened the photo gallery. Casually scrolling down through the images, he watched the dates rolling further back until he found a picture of the two of them. Had it really been a year since they'd taken a photo together? The image made him smile and ache in equal parts. Ashley was holding his head in both hands and was smashing her puckered lips against the side of his face. He was grinning like an idiot. He rolled his thumb across the screen to the previous picture. The two of them again, smiling with their heads leaning in against one another. He'd never really liked the way he looked in pictures until he'd met Ashley. Her smooth brown skin, full lips, and long curly brown hair seemed to somehow lend its beauty to him. Or maybe it was just that there was no need to force a smile when sharing a frame with her. Daniel looked at himself in the photo. His short black hair was the same. His long, slightly hooked nose was the same. His broad, crooked mouth was the same. If he was still that man, how could everything between them have changed so drastically? Daniel closed his eyes and grit his teeth. Everything felt backwards and upside down. This wasn't how their story was supposed to play out. They were soulmates. How many times had she said as much in the 4.5 years they'd been together? Most people didn't believe in true love, especially not at first sight. But for Daniel, Ashley had made it real. The idea of it had become a cliché warped by Hollywood romances and teen novels until it was something altogether misrepresented. The first time they'd met, he'd seen her passionate sexuality in the way she wore her clothes, subtly hidden, her joy written in the early etchings of her laugh lines. The way she stood and looked around the room told him so much about her strengths and her fears. Even though she had been a stranger and they had never shared a word, he had seen her joy and her pain and how openly she carried them both. Unlike the movies, their love at first sight had been more of a seed, which they'd chosen to nourish. He couldn't recall a single sentence of what he'd said to his previous class, but with crystal clarity he remembered the way she looked at him that first night, and the memory made him ache. Closing the photo gallery, his finger hovered instinctually over the message icon. His mind had run through hundreds of things he might text or tell her, but so far his efforts had only exacerbated the tension between them. He wished there was a way to convince her to give him even the slightest reprieve, to let him back in. Dan began scanning the walls of his classroom for a sign. He had always been able to turn to fiction for solace and for answers. Perhaps amongst the literary quotations he'd printed and placed around the room, he might find a hint at how he might turn things around. He had to chuckle at the first quote to catch his eye. "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." The paper hung above the door as a joke to his students and to himself, secretly displaying his distaste for the establishment that existed beyond that door. Now it seemed as though the joke was on him. Daniel turned off his phone and returned it to his desk drawer, just as he heard the classroom door open. Andy Peake was always the first of his students to arrive to fables and folklore. "Mr. Thiele, I have an idea." Andy was as skinny as he was tall, towering over all the other students and most of the faculty. When he had first met the young man at the beginning of the quarter, he found him to be detached, angry, and ultimately very intelligent. Andy made his way to Dan's desk and said in a flat tone, "So I've been thinking that since we're so swamped with our studies for finals and in our other classes, and since you've done such an amazing job teaching us to read and write stories, the best course of action for us all is to just ride out the next few weeks with a discussion or two and maybe a movie day." "Well, that supposes that everyone in class has nothing left to learn about how to read or write stories." Andy crossed his arms and gave a contemplative look. I'd say that's a fair assessment. You've pretty much taught us all we'll ever need to know. You should be proud." Dan nodded and smiled. "Well, then I think it only makes sense to share your superfluous talents with the world and give you all one more writing assignment to crown your high school experience with." Andy nodded reluctantly. "And besides," Mr. Thiele continued, "your attempts to flatter and manipulate me only fuels my desires to crush your hopes and dreams. You should know this about me by now. Andy loved talking with Mr. Teeley before class. There was no one else in his life that he felt this comfortable around. The jokes came easily between the two of them. This was the only place he felt like he could talk about his struggles with school, his parents, philosophy, or anything in his life for that matter. It was one of two reasons why he always showed up early for fables and folklore. The other had yet to arrive. Dan watched Andy make his way to his desk, drop his backpack on the floor with a flagrant disregard for its contents, and slide awkwardly into his seat. Dan wondered if Andy habitually showed up early to class to keep people from seeing him sit down at his desk. Andy stood a good 2 or 3 inches taller than Dan's height of 6'1", and everything about the kid seemed out of place. The slight asymmetry of his face, the broad, clumsy movements of his thin frame, the brown hair that was constantly in need of a haircut, and how his voice hadn't quite settled into the baritone range. All of it lent itself well to the gawky teenager cliché that Andy seemed to embody. Andy slid deeper into the one-piece desk chair thing that doubled as a state-mandated torture device for even slightly taller than average students. So if your goal is to crush our hopes and dreams, the best course of action would be to deny us the grace of your lesson plan, leaving us with a gaping hole in our education and thus utterly unprepared for the cold, harsh realities of life after high school. I'm sure life after high school will be plenty cold and harsh regardless. Andy smiled and wished he could be this calm and natural around everyone. He liked having someone he could speak his mind to without the fear of being reprimanded. There was so much bullshit in high school, and it was nice to have a teacher who wasn't so full of it. Once you got him talking, it was easy to keep Mr. Teeley going, which made his class that much easier to get through. It almost made him sad that he was going to graduate in 3 weeks, even though Mr. Teeley had told him that he would remain in contact once their student-teacher relationship was at an end. He would still miss this class. He knew Mr. Teeley was only 26 years old and was the only teacher that acted like an actual person and not some sort of authority figure separate from the rest of the human race. Maybe something happened to teachers who taught for too long. But it wasn't just teachers, it was most of the adults he knew. There must be some part in getting older that stole people's souls and left them empty, numb, and detached versions of their former selves. Maybe teachers should only be allowed to continue on a yearly basis depending on the grades they receive from their students, Andy considered. They could be graded on things like their ability to take a joke, or how often they smiled. People who hate their lives shouldn't be teaching impressionable youngsters how to function in the world. The door opened and several other students entered, and Andy's smile dimmed. Fables and folklore was easily his favorite class of his senior year. Maybe even his entire stint in high school. There was usually a writing assignment due each week, but the wonderful thing about fairy tales was that they were short, and you could write them about pretty much anything. It really didn't matter to Mr. Teeley as long as there was some semblance of a message or moral. Outside of that, there was no real homework, and as an added bonus, the class was right before lunch. But hands down, the best thing about fables and folklore was Ryoko Yamasaki. Today, she entered wearing tiny jean shorts and a colorful t-shirt hanging off one shoulder, exposing her bra strap. She was half Japanese, half white, but she had inherited the raven black hair from her Asian father, and it hung long and straight around her delicate neck and shoulders. Ryoko had helped him to the conclusion that he was definitely an ass and legs man. He guessed her breasts were small B cups, but that didn't bother him in the slightest. He'd be damned if they weren't the nicest B cups he had ever imagined touching. Curving down to her flat stomach, they fit so perfectly on her sleek frame that it was almost painful not to look. Her butt was a nearly perfect half circle, which ended right above two long, shapely legs. As always, Ryoko arrived alongside her best friend Jenna. Andy thought Jenna was pretty too, but in comparison, she was easy to overlook. She had a fair complexion and light blonde hair, which would be pretty if she didn't always wear it back in a braid. She just wasn't sporting the overall sexy package Ryoko was, but she did have some nice curves, especially in the chest area. Andy also definitely enjoyed the black-rimmed glasses she wore, as they gave her the sexy librarian, smart girl kind of vibe. When he'd first met the two of them, he considered pursuing her, thinking he'd never have a chance with Ryoko. But then he got to know the two of them, and that hadn't worked out so well in Jenna's favor either. He and Jenna had diametrically opposing views on almost every topic. Andy was exceedingly grateful to Mr. Teely for assigning the three of them to a group writing project early in the class where they were required to exchange telephone numbers and email. It was all he'd needed to get his foot in the door. Unfortunately, Andy had somehow fallen into the role of Ryoko's trusty guy friend, but seeing as how she thought most of high school guys were a joke, he figured if he just stuck in there, he'd get his chance sooner or later. Even though he got to hang out with her and Jenna during lunch and after school and talk with her on the phone most nights, this was their only class together. "Hey, Mr. Teely," Ryoko said, in her sweet soprano voice. Mr. Teely nodded with a friendly smile. "Miss Yamasaki?" She beamed, and Andy had to shake his head in wonderment. This was the other thing about Mr. Teely that blew his mind. All the little high school girlies swooned over him, and he never so much as flinched. Of course, he had the hottest black girlfriend Andy had ever seen, which probably helped. Mr. Teely was a moderately handsome guy with short-cut black hair and a nice smile, but he was no model or rock star. Andy had heard so many different girls chittering away about how dreamy he was and how much they wanted to have his babies and all the other crazy shit girls said. He'd never heard Ryoko say anything about it directly, but he could see it in the way she looked at him and hear it in the way she talked. The whole thing made him seriously consider becoming a high school teacher, or maybe a college professor, so he could actually sleep with his students. But that would mean he would have to go to college for like 10 years or something crazy, so it probably wasn't going to happen. Ryoko sat down in the front row in the desk to Andy's left. Ever since starting class, she had sat in the same desk with Jenna right behind her. As she put her bag down and started pulling out her books, she said, "Hey, Andy." In his smoothest, most exaggerated baritone voice, Andy mimicked Mr. Teely. "Miss Yamasaki?" Her pink lips widened in a dimpled grin, and she laughed. And she let a little laugh. Her pink lips widened in a dimpled grin, and the little laugh she gave made his heart jump. Making her smile felt a bit like going down the first drop on a roller coaster. It also made him want to throw his hands in the air and shout, and paradoxically, like he was going to throw up. He knew that he was far from the most popular guy in their school, especially since he stopped hanging out with his old friends in favor of Ryoko and Jenna, and now had essentially zero other friends. Nor was he by any means the most attractive, but occasionally he could make her laugh. Guys dug girls who could make them laugh. With that and a little persistence, Andy held on to the dream that he might one day see Ryoko naked. His only problem was that he couldn't do it consistently. It was like every now and then he would forget himself, and like it was with Mr. Teely, funny just came out. But once he made her laugh, he started asking himself what else he could do or say to keep her laughing, and it all fell apart. The last of the students shuffled in after the bell rang. Mr. Teely stood up from behind his desk and walked around to lean against the front of it. "How's everyone today?" A coalescing of sincere, mumbled, and non-existent answers spilled forth from the class. "Good to hear. Since next week is your last week before finals, I figured it's about time to discuss your final writing assignment. There won't be any final test or big essay to write, just another writing assignment like any of the others you've done throughout the quarter. I know you have other classes to study for, and I'm not of the mind that cramming lots of insignificant facts into your brains is real learning." Daniel turned around and faced the chalkboard at the front of the room. "Since this is the last assignment I'll be giving you, I've saved the best for last. We're going to explore my absolute favorite fairy tale character." One of the students couldn't help himself and blurted out, "Humpty Dumpty?" and got a few chuckles from the class. Without breaking stride, Mr. Teely replied, "Good guess. My actual favorite character is the quintessential, anthropomorphic, archetypal antagonist. At this point in the class, you should all know what those big words mean. If you need a refresher, I'm talking about the ultimate fairy tale villain. With a piece of chalk, he spelled out in large letters across the top of the board, "The Big Bad Wolf." "Why is he your favorite?" a student asked behind him. "Because he scares me. As a kid, I had several different copies of The Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood, and I always gravitated towards the versions where the wolf was depicted with sharper teeth and longer claws. There just wasn't anything appealing for me about the cartoonist versions of the wolf. If it didn't frighten me, I wasn't interested. Now, as an adult, I seem to find villains in movies and books to be far more interesting than the hero. And to me, it just doesn't get any better than the Big Bad Wolf." Anyways, I know most of you are probably familiar with the story of Little Red Riding Hood, but as a quick refresher, why don't you open your books to page... Mr. Teely glanced at the open book on his desk. Page 81, and read it over quickly so that it's fresh in your minds. Daniel watched his students pull out their books and begin to read. Sitting back down behind his desk, he slowly opened the top drawer and pulled out his phone. Half of him wanted to turn it on and see if she'd sent him anything, and half of him was afraid that the message box would still be at 0. After a long moment, he let out a silent sigh and put the phone back in his drawer and closed it. When he looked around the room, he noticed most of the students had put their books down. "Is anyone still reading?" When no one answered, he stood and walked back to the chalkboard. "All right, so let's take a look at the character of the wolf for a minute. I know we've talked about this before, so who can tell me what an archetype is?" Ryoko was the first to raise her hand. Mr. Teely pointed to her with a piece of chalk. "An archetype is an instinctual expression, usually in the form of a recurring symbol or character that expresses human nature and the experiences that we all share." Mr. Teely nodded and said, "Wow, I think you got it word for word out of the textbook. Would anyone else like to describe it in their own words?" Ryoko swallowed and lowered her eyes, unsure if Mr. Teely's response was a denunciation. Jenna raised her hand, and Mr. Teely gave her a nod. Jenna paused for a moment, then replied, "Archetypes are things that show up again and again in stories and cultures, even ones that are separated by distance and time. And they show up so often because they are indicative of what it is to be a human." Wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions about what an archetype is? No? All right, then let's explore the archetype of the wolf. Who can give me some examples of where the wolf shows up in stories as the enemy of man? Dan turned to face the empty spot on the board where and the students began to shout out their answers. "Werewolves." "All right, good, that's a big one." Dan quickly dashed the word werewolves across the board. "Here's one I'd be surprised if you knew." He turned to the class. He turned and wrote Gomork on the board. "Anyone know who Gomork is?" The class was silent. "He's the wolf that hunts Atreyu in the never-ending story." "Maybe if we had more days where we watched movies, we'd be more cultured," a student said from the rear of the class. "The Never-Ending Story was a book before it was a movie, but thank you for your feedback." Andy thought of one. "There's a she-wolf in the Inferno that blocks Dante's path at the beginning of the journey." "Excellent." Andy had only read through the first 5 or 6 pages of the book upon Mr. Teely's recommendation, but being that it was a poem and an old one at that, most of what he'd read was lost on him. One part of the book that had stuck with him, however, was the image of the starving she-wolf, who became more ravenous the more she ate. That was pretty damn cool. "What about wargs in Lord of the Rings?" "Sure." Jenna raised her hand and asked, "Do dogs count? A black dog is a kind of ghost that haunts places in England and can be an omen of death." "Dogs are usually more representative of a helpful agent in stories, and we're more looking for the enemy figure of the wolf. A black dog is also sometimes called a barghest. We can write that over here in a sort of category." "Cerberus," another boy called out. "Once again, that's a dog, but he guards the gates of the underworld and keeps people from escaping, so I guess he could be construed as an enemy. We'll put that in the sort of category again. Any others?" "The wolf from The Boy Who Cried Wolf," a student answered. "Peter and the Wolf," Ryoko added. Great. I think that will do for a start." Dan finished writing and continued. "So even from this small list, We can see how the figure of the wolf has played into the storytelling all over the world, in tales new and old. So in this version of Little Red Riding Hood you just read, she's taking food to her sick grandma. She's told to stay on the path by her mother, but she meets the big bad wolf along the way. When he finds out where she's going, he tells her to take a shortcut through the woods. She does, but it's not actually a shortcut. The wolf races ahead and tricks the grandmother, pretending to be Little Red Riding Hood. Pretending to be Little Red Riding Hood, then swallows her whole. When Little Red Riding Hood shows up, she finds the wolf dressed in her grandmother's clothing. The wolf then tricks her, swallows her whole, and falls asleep. A woodsman finds the wolf and cuts him open and frees Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. How does this shape our understanding of the archetypal wolf? How does this shape our understanding of what the archetypal wolf represents to man? Jenna was the first to speak up. I don't really think the big bad wolf deserves his title. Andy rolled his eyes. Okay, why not? Mr. Teely asked. Because he's an animal. He's a carnivore and wants to eat Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. I don't think he should be held responsible for the fact that he eats meat. Mr. Teely nodded. Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. For one, wolves are actually omnivores, but that's not really on the point, since they still primarily eat meat. What's important to note here is that the wolf deceives Little Red Riding Hood. He swallows the grandmother whole and then dresses up in her clothing to trick Little Red. Would you consider that, his fingers made quotation marks in the air, bad? Not really, not from the wolf's perspective. He's a predator. He shouldn't be labeled as a bad wolf just because he's smart enough to trick his prey. In his eyes, fooling a little human girl is no different than fooling a little baby deer. We can't judge him by human standards. Eating little helpless animals, even little girls and feeble grandmas, is his way of surviving. All right, that's an interesting take. Anyone else agree? Disagree? Andy couldn't help himself. He raised his hand and spoke up. Yeah, I don't know about that. I think we can safely say, carnivore or not, anything that eats us and or our children is a bad thing, regardless of what species it is. Maybe if this was a story wolf mothers told their little story, maybe if this was a story wolf mothers told their little wolf cubs, that would be the case. But this is a human fable. Perhaps the big bad wolf isn't really evil, but he's just about as bad for us as you can get. Jenna was ready with a reply. Getting killed by a wolf doesn't make the wolf bad. The wolf doesn't have a choice in the matter. They should have called him the Big Hungry Wolf, or titled the story The Careless Red Riding Hood. Her voice was starting to edge into agitation. You can't villainize a creature just for succumbing to its nature. Ryoko watched the two of them with a strange sense of envy. It baffled her that the two of them could argue so fervently and express themselves so freely without concern for the other person's anger. But she guessed they must actually enjoy some part of it, because even when Mr. Teely wasn't fanning the fire, they did it all the time. She enjoyed listening to them, though, as they usually both had smart things to say, regardless of the topic. Andy continued. Sure I can. I can villainize anything I want. Jenna's eyes closed and her jaw tightened. Okay, I guess you can, but that doesn't mean it makes sense to do so. Mr. Teely interceded. Let me stop you for a moment to point something out to the class. These two aren't just arguing about the nature of the big bad wolf. They're really exploring the nature of villainy. Are there things that truly make someone a bad guy, or does it just depend on who you ask? Andy continued with the debate. Okay, I honestly don't think there's much depth to this story. I think the author called him the big bad wolf to make it clear to children that wolves are dangerous. It's just a method of scaring little kids into behaving a certain way with tales of monsters and demons. I mean, back when this was written, going to Grandma's house alone was actually somewhat dangerous for little girls. They might actually be eaten by a wolf. Jenna took a breath to calm herself and said, I grant you that it might be a simple way of explaining to children the dangers of walking alone through the woods, but that doesn't make it correct. You could argue the same thing for teaching a child that water is dangerous because they might drown in it. Just because something is unsafe doesn't make it bad or evil. Goldilocks and the Big Bad River just sounds stupid. Dan smiled inwardly. This was his favorite part of teaching, when the students took charge of exploring their own ideas. Granted, it was usually Andy and Jenna and Ryoko who led the discussions, but when they spoke, the other students listened. Ryoko raised her hand, and Mr. Teely gave her a glance and a nod. Ryoko? What if the wolf isn't a wolf at all? What if the wolf simply represents wolfish traits in humanity? I mean, he can talk, and he's even smart enough to pretend to be a human. What if the story is really about not trusting strangers? Mr. Teely nodded slowly. So you're saying that the wolf might just be a representation of a certain type of person. So how does that possibility play out with your two stances? He smiled down at her, and it made her chest flutter. This was why Ryoko loved this class. Mr. Teely could draw out these sorts of ideas and discussions from his students. He always asked questions that made her realize there was more to the story than she suspected. Jenna jumped in. People are different, and then we can make choices. Wolves don't have that luxury, so I mean, if the wolf is really just a human, then I suppose you could call him bad. Andy shook his head. I don't think it works that way. You say that the wolf is exempt from our judgments because it's his nature to kill little girls. But it's well within the nature of man to kill little girls too. People do things like lie and steal and kill all the time. So that makes it pretty clear that those actions are just as much a part of being a human as anything else. But just because it's part of our nature doesn't instantly justify it or get us off the hook. You can't villainize people and not villainize animals just because we have a broader range of actions. People can choose to act against their nature. Animals can't. Being civilized is what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. Andy could tell by her tone that she was getting upset now, and he had to keep his smile in check. Mr. Teely stood up from where he was leaning against his desk. Let's hold up here. We're straying from the path and risking getting lost in some pretty deep philosophical woods. Hopefully this little discussion has given you all some ideas and planted some seeds in your mind for possible themes to explore in your final stories. Ryoko raised her hand. What do you think about the archetype of the wolf? What I think is inconsequential. You young people are here to learn and think for yourselves. The goal of this class isn't just to get you to read and study old stories. It's to teach you the art of interpretation and evaluation, and maybe a little bit about the art of making things up. But I try to go light on the bullshitting, because I'm sure you've gotten more than enough training in that regard during the rest of your education. But don't worry, it's not for nothing, as it will be an invaluable skill in college. The class laughed. But seriously, learning to see beneath the surface of a situation is an extremely useful skill. Even if you never read another book or watch another movie with the hope of learning something, it can help you in your everyday interactions with other people. Ryoko's gaze never left him as he began to pace the front of the classroom. His hands and fingers danced with his words, and his eyes focused somewhere beyond the confines of the room which held them. It was so enchanting to see him lose himself when he was passionate about teaching them something. When we see people smiling or shaking hands or crying, these are all signs of an emotion or a motive. Just as there is hidden meanings in stories, there are hidden meanings in our everyday lives. And your life is a story. And there may be times when you need to look at your past and your present and figure out why you are doing the things you are doing. In everything that goes on around you, there is something else going on just beneath the surface. So if I told you what I thought, I'd be robbing you of a valuable learning experience. Andy was waiting with a smile and a reply. But you told us that one of the reasons we should read is to get new perspectives on things. But you told us one of the reasons we should read is to get new perspectives on things. And I think it would be valuable for us to hear your perspective. Mr. Teely chuckled. Well, I suppose you've got me there. So let's see. What do I think about the wolf? Andy glanced over at Ryoko and found a smile on her lips, which brought one to his. Mr. Teely's head tilted sideways in a moment of contemplation. Okay, so I agree with Jenna that from the wolf's perspective, he is not the bad guy. But I also agree with Andy. With Little Red Riding Hood as the protagonist, he is most certainly big and bad and a wolf. I also agree that the wolf cannot change his nature, but the wolf is obviously not just a wolf, right? He's anthropomorphic. He can talk and think just like a human. He even disguises himself as a human, a wolf in human clothing, so to speak. And in line with what Andy was saying, I think that who we call a villain is a matter of opinion. Maybe when Jenna writes her story of Little Red Riding Hood, maybe when Jenna writes her wolf story, Little Red Riding Hood will be the antagonist. Little Red's naivete certainly puts her and her grandmother's lives in danger, so you could, in that respect, label her as bad. But I could also argue that she's just a child, and maybe that gives her some moral leeway. Or you could take it one step further and say the enemy was poor parenting. Mr. Teeley shrugged. I think another important takeaway here is that as authors and readers you don't necessarily need a diabolical reason to make someone the bad guy. Maybe they're just the person or force that opposes the main character. Two men fighting for one woman's love. Two nations racing to be the first to the moon. Remember, whatever your perspective may be, the author chose to call this character the Big Bad Wolf. So maybe the right question isn't was he right in doing so, but why did he choose that name? What did he want to say? And perhaps most interesting idea here, and perhaps the most I need to drink water. And perhaps the most interesting idea here for me has to do with what Jenna was thinking. The antagonist rarely, if ever, sees themselves as the antagonist. The wolf is trying to achieve his own ends, survive, and do things that will lead to his happiness, even if he's mistaken and it all leads to his death. But does he really have a choice? He feeds on others. He doesn't see himself as the villain, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's not a villain. Remember, the name of the story is Little Red Riding Hood. If the story were called The Big Hungry Wolf, then perhaps the woodsman would be the bad guy rather than the hero. There is an infinite number of possibilities. There is an infinite number of possible ways to view a given story. Like I've said before, as it is with stories, so it is with dreams. It's not what happens within them that matters. It's how you interpret them that tells you who you are. So I want you to take some of these ideas and run with them. For your final assignment, I would like each of you once again to write your very own fairy tale. This time, as you may have guessed, about a wolf. He or she needn't be the same old big bad wolf from the stories you know, but I'd like you to draw on the archetype that we've discussed as the wolf as the enemy of man. Again, I'm refraining from giving you a big test, and in exchange, I want some quality work. All right, get started on your drafts. Jenna leaned forward in her seat behind Ryoko and said, "Andy, sometimes I think you argue with me just to argue." Looking back at her, Andy shrugged. More time spent talking is less time spent doing classwork. He did his best to keep his eyes from wandering to the top of her cleavage. Jenna had large, squeezable-looking breasts, though he doubted they would be as firm or as perky as Ryoko's once the bra came off. Of course, he didn't have any evidence to support the idea, just his intuition. Jenna and her breasts had been there to help him through quite a few of his recreational imaginings, but still, she was no Ryoko. He wondered if Jenna would villainize him for staring at her breasts if she ever caught him, given that it was his nature as an 18-year-old boy. He turned back and inspected Ryoko's figure. The most appealing part about her, besides her body, was that she had the beauty to be accepted into the popular circles, but made no attempt. She was walking around with a free pass to popularity and prestige, but never used it. This discordance with the norm made her that much more attainable in Andy's mind, and as he himself was considerably out of touch with the prevailing high school standards of popularity. And that, maybe more than anything, lent itself to the lofty idea that he might have a chance with her. Unlike the other beauties that attended the school, Ryoko was theoretically attainable, and she actually talked to him. God knew that every pretty rich boy jock hybrid had taken a shot at her. Occasionally she would give one of them the time of day, but it never lasted. Andy still wasn't sure if she was a virgin or not. He would be amazed if she was, but she never talked about sex, at least not with him. There were moments, usually directly following a session of irresponsible fantasizing, where it occurred to him how over the top and far-fetched his idea of being with her was, that maybe he should just go find a girl who was decently pretty and fun and be with her, but that never lasted. Her perfect ass, her beautiful white smile, and the dark angular eyes had him trapped. Every curve of her was mesmerizing. If there was any symbolism truly worth studying in this class, it was sitting right next to him. And here we have a page break. I'm going to get a drink of water. Okay. We continue. I'll meet you guys out at the car, Ryoko said. I have to ask Mr. Teely about something real quick. Jenna and Andy nodded and walked out of the classroom with the rest of the students who were rushing out to lunch. Ryoko pulled the journal out of her bag, and the butterflies in her stomach began to flutter in earnest. The school year was almost over, and she wondered if today she would have the strength to show him. She would, she decided. Today would be different. When he looked up to meet her eyes, her courage wavered. He sat behind his desk, holding his cell phone in his hand, smiling, but she could feel the effort behind it, in the neutrality of his gaze. Hey Ryoko, what's up? During class, he smoked and smiled without effort. She knew just how relaxed and natural and happy he could be. Yet whenever she had him alone, no matter how much work she put into her assignments, no matter how friendly she was, or what she said, there was always a distance between them. A wall that was there. A wall that always appeared when they were alone. I just want to get your feedback on something. She held up the leather-bound journal and opened to a page with a silk bookmark, and pointed to the poem she had spent most of the prior week working on. He reached out and took the journal from her. Of course. He leaned back and she watched his eyes move over the lines. Her attention flitted between the pages and his expression. The page and his expression. When he finished, the same mild, impersonal smile made its way across his face. This is very good, Ryoko. I like the structure you've used. Thanks. His words were warm, but his tone was like ice water in her veins. She wanted to grab him and shake him and plead with him just to tell her the truth. Tell her she sucked. Tell her she was average. Tell her whatever, as long as it was him. As long as it was him. The same him she'd seen speaking to the class so many times. You've really come a long way during this quarter. I've seen a drastic improvement in your prose and in your poetry. These were the things he would say to any student who came in and asked for his opinion about something they had written. She would show him, though, she thought. The book was still in his hands. All she had to do was turn a few pages and let him read it. Then he would see what she was really capable of as a writer. But he would also almost certainly ask her what had inspired the poem. Then he wouldn't be able to stop. Then she wouldn't be able to keep it a secret any longer. She'd have to tell him everything, and finally someone would know about what she'd endured at the hands of her father, and she'd have someone to talk to, besides her therapist, who still only knew half the story. But there was also the possibility that he would read it and not ask, that he might not like it, that he might not read between the lines and see what it was really about. He might just smile and tell her again in that friendly, distant voice how proud he was of her, and pat her on the head for her good effort, and send her on her way. She wished he would just engage, to meet her fully, even if it meant finding out she wasn't any good. Dan closed the book and held it out for her. I was just about to head out. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Ryoko took the journal and placed it back in her bag. No. Thank you, though, for reading my work. Thank you for sharing it with me. I really do enjoy reading your poems. Ryoko nodded and smiled widely, but he didn't seem to notice as he looked back down at his phone, turning it on. All right, I'll see you Monday, Mr. Teely. Sure thing. Page break. It was always an awkward walk to the car for Jenna and Ryoko. I'm sorry. It was always an awkward walk to the car for Jenna without Ryoko there as a buffer. She and Andy never really knew what to talk about without her. To ease the discomfort, Jenna said, I feel bad for Mr. Teely. Why? Andy asked. It has to be hard dealing with so many students and helping them with all their problems. Ryoko just shows him her poetry. I know, but I feel like even that has to be tough. People coming to you every day with their work, and you have to do your best to help them. Yeah, I'm sure Mr. Teely is stressed out about a girl like Ryoko coming to him after class and asking him for his expert opinion and hoping to find herself in his good graces. A girl like Ryoko. The words rolled around in Jenna's mind. She wondered what type of girl she was like. Maybe you're right. I just don't know if I could handle that much responsibility. Andy smiled. Yeah, I can only imagine what it's like for him, having droves of teenage girls clamoring for his attention day in and day out. Sounds like a walking nightmare. The word is clamoring. And if you had girls swooning over you every day and you couldn't do anything about it, you would be in hell. Granted, but he also has an insanely hot girlfriend he gets to go home to every night, which probably makes it a tad easier on him. And regardless, I'd rather have his problem than mine. Students graduate, you know. Jenna couldn't keep her eyes from rolling. For all his seeming intelligence, sometimes Andy was such a disgusting idiot. When they reached Ryoko's car, the sun was beating down on them, and Jenna wished she had grabbed the keys from Ryoko so she could at least open the doors to let out the heat trapped in the car. Andy leaned against the passenger side door and turned back towards the school like a puppy waiting for its owner. Jenna knew it was petty, but sometimes she just hated Andy. It was like she didn't exist, or that she existed only as something he had to endure to be around Ryoko. No, that wasn't fair to Andy. He couldn't control what he wanted, and it was not his responsibility to love her or be nice to her. It really wasn't about him. It was the same way with every guy they met. Even if they had expressed interest in her to begin with, as soon as they met Ryoko, that marked the end of any romance Jenna might have had. A smile lit up Andy's face, and she didn't even have to turn to know that Ryoko had just exited the school. She turned, and sure enough, her best friend was walking their way. Jenna couldn't deny Ryoko's beauty, the way her body moved, her kind spirit, and her wonderful mind. But she wished that just once someone would choose her over Ryoko, that just once she would be the object of desire. She shook her head, and even just the thought of it made her feel small. How did things go? Andy asked. Fine, Ryoko said, remotely unlocking her car. Andy opened the passenger door and said, Cool, where do you want to go to lunch today? Jenna could see the pain behind Ryoko's smile. It was the same pain Ryoko always had. After she'd shown Mr. Teely her work, Jenna had attempted to address it in the past, but Ryoko maintained that everything was fine. It reminded her of what Mr. Teely had said about looking beneath the surface. He was right. There was something else going on here. She would need to work harder to understand her friend and see deeper into the truth of Ryoko's heart. Page break. Water drinking happening. All right. Still no word. Daniel made sure the ringer was on full volume before dropping it into his pocket. He rose from his desk, checking to make sure he had his keys and wallet, when his door opened. The Spanish teacher from the next room over peeked her head in. Hey, I just wanted to stop in and see how you're doing. Dan detected a sympathetic tone in her voice. Did she know about Ashley? No. How could she? I'm good. Why wouldn't I be? The Spanish teacher looked slightly surprised by his response. Oh, you haven't heard? Daniel heard the stress and an impatient edge in his response. Hear what? About Katie Garland. Katie Garland. The name made his stomach turn and his mouth turn dry. Dan did everything he could to maintain his composure, keeping his face still, even as a rampant fear coursed through his veins. He hadn't spoken or heard to Katie since last summer, and hadn't thought of her in nearly as long. What happened? Dan's voice was calm and his face a mask. God, I thought you'd have heard already. She took a long breath and continued. She fell off the balcony of an apartment complex in the city. It was a 9-story fall, but she lived. Last I heard, she was in a coma. It's just horrible. Oh my God. Dan stood staring at the Spanish teacher, but he did not see her. He was lost in a tumult of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Katie Garland, his most prized student and his closest kept secret, all tangled up in one young girl. I'm so sorry. She looked like she wanted to give him a hug, but stayed where she was. He nodded. Was it on purpose? I don't think anyone knows, not that I've heard at least. Are you sure you're okay? Yeah, I'm okay. It's just a shock. I know, it's horrible when things like this happen to students. I remembered that she always had her nose in a book, and that you two were close. Dan swallowed and nodded. The Spanish teacher said something else which he didn't consciously follow, but he responded with another nod, and she eventually closed the door and left him alone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He opened his contacts and typed in GARL. His contact list was filtered down to 2 names, Emma Garland and Katie Garland. He tapped on Emma and held the phone up next to his ear, waiting. There was only a single ring before he heard Katie's aunt answer. Hello, Mr. Teely? He could hear the exhaustion in her voice behind the thin veil of cordial happiness. Miss Garland, I just heard what happened. How is she doing? Her response came after a long pause. She's not doing well. She's stable, but her brain is swollen, or was swollen. I can't quite get a clear answer out of these doctors. Okay, do you mind if I come see her after I finish my last class today? Not at all. I think it would be good to have you here. She told him which hospital they were at, and he wrote the room number on his hand. All right, I'll see you soon. Daniel locked up his classroom and walked out to his car. Thankfully, he had parked beneath the shade of a tree, and his car was relatively cool compared to the air outside. He sat and closed the door, bringing on a relative quiet, and drew in a long, ragged breath. He raised his hand and turned the rearview mirror to face him, looking himself in the eye. Were there tears behind those eyes? Tears for Katie Garland? He did his utmost to identify the tumult of feelings churning in his gut. Fear, regret, anger, shame. Feelings he had done his best to set aside when they had gone their separate ways nearly a year ago. But there was one emotion he wished he did not feel, and he had to turn his mirror back to the rear of the car. Was he a monster for feeling it? He didn't want Katie to die, but more than the pain that Katie and her accident had brought to the surface of his consciousness, he felt a touch of relief. No, he said aloud into the emptiness of his car. He was not going to think that way. He wanted Katie to live, regardless of the secrets they shared. He was about to start his car when a new realization crossed his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, but gave a moment's pause. Was it wrong to use this? No. It was the truth, wasn't it? She would want to know. He opened his list of favorite contacts and selected Ashley's name. Holding the phone to his ear, he felt a twinge of anxiety, and the thought that she might not answer. He felt a twinge of anxiety at the thought that she might not answer, but after the 5th ring, she picked up. Hey. Dan wasn't sure where to start. Are you there? Yeah. What's up? Her voice was sharp with an edge of impatience. Do you remember me telling you about a student of mine that graduated last year named Katie Garland? Yeah, of course. The girl with the fucked up parents. Right. Well, last night, Dan paused. Whether it was the words, or whether it was the words or that he was speaking to Ashley, he didn't know. But the heat rose up behind his eyes, and the rest of the sentence caught in his throat. Ashley must have heard the distress as she responded, "What happened? Are you all right?" With a deep inhale, he was able to push the quavering words out, and with them came a stream of warm tears running down his cheeks. She fell from a 9-story apartment building. She fell from the ninth story of an apartment balcony. Ugh. Sorry, one sec. She fell from the ninth story apartment balcony. Sorry, I have to rewrite that. Oh, Dan, I'm so sorry. She's in a coma. I'm gonna go see her at the hospital after school. Jesus. Okay. Will you call me whenever you get done? His composure began to return, and he said, "All right, I'll let you know. Do you want me to bring some dinner over?" The question warmed his heart, and he couldn't help but smile. "Sure, that would be great. If there's anything else you need, just let me know." "I will. Thanks, Ash." "Of course. I'll see you tonight. Goodbye." He hung up the phone and let his hand fall into his lap. His head hung, and he found it easy now to go to that place. So he did, letting the sobs shake him and the tears roll down his face. He looked around to see if there were any students walking through the teacher's lot, but he was alone, so he continued to cry, though he wasn't sure if it was for Katie, or for Ashley, or for himself. And that is the end of chapter 2. And I'm going to get another drink of water here, and then we'll start chapter 3. Chapter 3. Objects of Desire. Okay, where does it start? Here we go. Emma woke in the corner of Katie's hospital room, disoriented and slightly slouched over in one of the chairs. A masculine figure stood beside Katie, with the drapes drawn and the light of the room off. Only a soft golden glow of the overhead lamp above Katie's bed gave any shape to the man. "Mr. Teely?" The figure shifted ever so slightly, but did not respond. Emma shook her head and slid her glasses back up over her nose and straightened herself in her chair. The figure came into focus, but her head was still waking up. For the briefest moment, she thought it was her father standing there, but she knew that was impossible. After another shake, she realized who the tall, broad-shouldered man was. It was not her father. It was her brother, Katie's father. "Richard, what? When were you going to tell me?" He cut in, not turning to look back in her direction. Even though she could not see his face, she could hear his anger through the slight quavering in his words. Her body instinctively tensed. "Never would be my guess," he continued. His large hand brushed softly against his daughter's swollen and discolored cheek. The smell of bourbon that clouded the room was like an overused cologne. Emma inhaled slowly through her nose in order to keep herself even. Richard turned to look at her. It was haunting how closely he resembled their father, though perhaps it was simply the smell of him that triggered the memory. His eyes were swollen, red, and laden with regret. She couldn't bear to look at him for more than a moment. Her hand instinctively moved to her chest and grasped the ornate brass key that hung from a chain around her neck. Richard caught the gesture and shook his head with derision. Still just a little girl. A wave of shame washed over her, but she did not loosen her grip on the key. Instead, her hand held firm and she swallowed hard. Closing her eyes for a moment, she took in another deep breath, trying to ignore the acidic odor, opened her eyes and stood. There, she could see him clearly. He had not aged well. He was as tall and as well-muscled as ever, but now his muscles looked slack, like too many sacks thrown over an old, tired horse. His light hair had thinned considerably, and he didn't seem to lean so much as hunch forward over Katie's hospital bed. But his broad, angular jaw, set and clenched as it was, reminded her that even though the years may have worn him down, he was still the same stubborn and callous man she remembered. But he wouldn't do anything here, she told herself, not with doctors and nurses moving around right outside the room, and not with Katie here. I haven't seen you in 6 years. I had no idea where you were. How was I supposed to tell you anything? Did you even try? His voice was still a whisper, and though trying not to wake, his voice was still a whisper, as though trying not to wake his sleeping child. The truth was that she hadn't even thought of him, and wouldn't have contacted him if she had. He didn't deserve to touch her or see her or lament for her. She didn't want him in this room or at this hospital, but she couldn't say any of that. We haven't seen or heard from you in 6 years. Emma chose the word we, knowing it would wound him, and she was right. A flicker of pain cut through the alcohol daze, and his eyes sank, suddenly lost in the floor at his feet. Who is that sitting outside the door? His gaze returned, now more wounded than angry. Was the boy still out there? He's one of Katie's friends. He showed up when they brought her out of surgery. Richard focused on her as she paused. The young man had brought her Katie's silver shoes, but she couldn't tell him that. She didn't mind punishing her brother for his own reprehensible behavior, but she didn't need to remind him of the loss of Katie's mother. Not right now. Luckily, the shoes were concealed beneath her jacket, where neither she nor Richard could see them. Neither she nor Richard could see them. She didn't want to even think about it herself. It was one of the things that made her question whether Katie's fall had been an accident. The fact that she had worn her mother's silver shoes to her friend's apartment, was very strange. And according to the young man, who for some reason was still waiting just outside the door, Katie had removed them before going out on the balcony. He was there when she fell. Richard turned away, even from Katie. She wished she didn't need to keep things from him. She wished she could just hug her brother and have someone to hold and share in this pain with. He and Katie were the only family she had left. Was there anyone else out there with her? His voice was still hushed. No, not according to the people at the apartment. The police said that someone heard a scream and went out to see, and that's when they saw what happened. A quiet washed over the room, and only the soft humming and infrequent beeps from the medical machines filled the space between them. Emma knew the most painful of possibilities was at the forefront of both their thoughts. Richard finally broke the silence. How long is she going to be like this? I don't know. Well, what did they tell you? I don't think they know either. She saw his jaw clench even tighter. He inhaled in sharp, uneven jerks as she watched him fight to swallow down the urge to cry. His fingers pinched at the bridge of his nose. Why couldn't he just let it out? Here would be the one place where no one could judge him for his pain. Page break. Okay. Daniel found his way up to the 4th floor of the hospital and followed the directions he'd been given. Glancing into the little waiting room outside, he found a handful of people, some of which looked like they might be friends of Katie, but none of which he recognized. He continued down the hallway, counting down the room numbers as he passed. His heart began to race with the realization that he had not seen Katie since the night of her graduation nearly a year prior. It was incredible how absent that night, as amazing and confusing as it has been. Excuse me. It was incredible how absent that night, as amazing and haunting as it was, had been from his thoughts during the past year. All of it nearly forgotten in the slow decay of his relationship with Ashley. As he turned a corner, nearing Katie's room, he was greeted with an unusual sight. A teenage boy sitting on the floor with an old leather backpack between him and the wall. As Daniel approached, the boy's eyes opened and found him. "Hi, is this Katie's room?" Daniel asked, seeing the number on the wall matching the one he'd written on his hand. The young man continued to stare. "Yeah." His voice was soft and meek. "Are you Mr. Teely?" That surprised Daniel. "I am," he replied, and waited for more. The boy only tilted his head as if in contemplation. "You're a friend of Katie's?" The young man didn't respond for a moment, then nodded his head. "My name's Caleb." "Well, Caleb, it sucks we had to meet under these circumstances, but I'm glad you're here." Caleb nodded his head again. Daniel went to step past him, but stopped. "Just curious, how did you know who I was?" Daniel looked up and responded, "Katie showed me a picture of you. She talked about you quite a bit." "Oh." Daniel managed a small smile, and not knowing what else to say, continued into the hospital room. He knocked softly on the door as he entered. In the dim light of the room, he saw Katie's aunt moving to greet him. "Mr. Teely, you don't know how much I appreciate you stopping by." She opened her arms, and he stepped forward to hug her. He was surprised at her appearance. She looked like she'd been here for a week, rather than less than a full day. Her grayish-red hair had been pulled back into a bun, but more than a few strands had escaped and frayed in wild directions. And the long yellow and red flower-patterned dress she wore over her thin frame was severely wrinkled. As Daniel turned towards the hospital bed to his right, he realized there was someone else in the room, staring silently at the two of them. A rather large, older man stood, blocking his direct line of sight to Katie. After the brief hug ended with Miss Garland, Daniel stepped forward to shake the man's hand and introduce himself. "Hi, I'm Daniel Teely. I was Katie's high school English teacher last year." The man took his hand and squeezed it unnecessarily hard. Daniel squeezed back out of reflex, but doubted the bigger man felt much of anything. "I'm Richard, Katie's father." Daniel tried not to show the surprise or the disdain he felt as he replied, "Nice to meet you." After an awkward moment, he turned back to Miss Garland, not knowing what else he might say to the man, whom he knew far too much about. "I came as soon as I could." "Oh, don't worry about that. I'm just grateful you came. I know she'd be happy to see you." Richard stepped forward, nearly walking into Daniel, and turned out the door and into the hallway without a word. When Daniel turned back to the room, he saw her. He had known what he might find, but for some strange reason he'd had a vision of Katie laying in her hospital bed, sleeping peacefully. Nothing could have been farther from what lay before him. He walked slowly into the dim glow surrounding her. She was barely recognizable. The parts of her face that weren't bandaged were swollen to an extent that he had never encountered before. Tiny crusts of scabbed blood clung to her nostrils and the corner of one of her eyes. Her skin was blotched with sticky mixture of red and purple and yellow. A clear plastic tube protruded from her mouth and was taped to her face. "They said it was lucky that she fell onto the grass," said Miss Garland. Miss Garland said, her voice quavering. Lucky was not a word he would use to describe anyone in Katie's situation. He couldn't look any longer, so he turned back to face her aunt. I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am. It's not an easy thing to understand how something like this could happen. That's true. I want to thank you again for coming, and I'm not just saying that. I know it would mean the world to her if you were world to her that you're here, and it means an incredible amount to me as well. Since getting the phone call last night, things have gotten progressively worse and worse, and honestly, I feel like you stopping by has been the first positive thing to happen in a long string of negatives. Daniel caught Emma shooting a worried glance out the door, which quickly came back to him and did its best to hide behind a tired smile. Well, I'm happy that's the case, even if it's under these circumstances. Katie is an amazing girl. She's always been full of surprises. My bet is that she has more in store for us. He did his best to offer a sympathetic smile in return. Yeah, she is full of surprises. Daniel noticed Emma's hands begin to subconsciously fidget as her thumbnail picked and dug under the fingernails of her other hand. Last night, when I got home, I knocked on her door to see if she was in her room. When I did, her door swung open. There was no response, so I looked inside, and what I saw shocked and sorry, excuse me. And I was shocked to find that her room was clean. Everything was organized and put away. Water shone on the edges of the older woman's eyes, and Daniel waited for her to continue. It was always a point of contention between the two of us. Katie never cleaned her room. Emma realized that she'd said too much, and the implication now hung heavily in the air between them. A look of deep concern slowly spread across the young man's face who'd so graciously come to visit. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she just keep her worries to herself? She didn't need to burden him or anything else with her childish fears. Was there anything else strange about the room? Emma shook her head, wanting nothing more than to change the subject. I don't think so. I wasn't sure what to make of it, so I just closed her door and left it alone. Mr. Teeley reached out a hand and placed it on her shoulder. I don't think you should worry. This is a situation that would make anyone question and wonder, and I'm sure there are a million things running through your head at any given moment. I know there are in mine, and I can only imagine what this must be like for you. But I think we should both be careful not to start piecing unrelated events together just to try to make sense of a situation we don't fully understand. Emma nodded solemnly. You're right. You're right. Thank you. After another long pause, Daniel stepped back and grinned. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but you look like you've been through a natural disaster. They both laughed. I want to do you a favor and go pick up some clothing and some toiletries from your house so that you can feel a bit more like a person again. Oh, that's nice of you to offer, but totally unnecessary. Daniel shook his head. I insist. I feel helpless enough as it is. Please let me do this one small thing for you so that I can feel like I've been at least of some assistance. Emma considered for a moment and then resigned, realizing that a toothbrush and a change of clothing might make a slight difference in how she felt. And she really hadn't given much thought to how utterly haggard she must look. All right, but only a few things. Emma got a pen and notepad from her purse and made a list of the few pieces of clothing and personal items she thought she might need, and a description of where he'd find them in her house. She handed the list to him, as well as a key, and wrote the address across the top of the paper, and handed it to the young man and thanked him again. Thank you for letting me help, he said, giving her another hug. As Daniel left the room, he stopped to regard the kid sitting on the floor. Hey, I think it would be fine if you went in. The boy continued to look down the hallway, and when Daniel followed his gaze, he saw Katie's father walking away towards the elevator. Caleb turned and said, He was listening while you talked. Daniel looked back down at Caleb. Really? Oh, well, there wasn't much to hear, but like I said, you can go inside the room. I'm sure Miss Garland wouldn't mind. I don't really feel like seeing Katie. Daniel could understand that. Having stopped, he took a moment to look Caleb over. He noticed how ragged, he had noticed how ragged Katie's aunt, sorry, excuse me, let me get a drink of water. The young boy looked about as ragged as Katie's aunt, but his clothing looked about 2 or 3 days further out from a recent wash. And the kid himself looked like he might just be old enough to be in college, but he had no hint of facial hair. "Do you live or go to school around here?" Daniel asked. "Yeah, kind of," he shrugged. "Do you have a car or some way to get home?" The young man's posture stiffened slightly at the question. "I'll be fine." "All right, man. Well, I'll be back in a while. Do you want me to grab you anything while I'm out?" "I'll be fine." "Okay, well, see you in a few then," Daniel said, and turned to walk towards the stairs. Page break. Daniel drove directly to the Garland house. Using the key Emma had given him, he opened the front door and closed it behind him. The house was just as he remembered it, huge, conspicuously tidy, and full of well-displayed antiques. He made his way up the stairs and found Katie's room. It was much like he remembered it, with colorful sketches pinned to the walls, posters of classic movies. The thing that set it apart from most teenagers' bedrooms, though, were the 3 floor-to-ceiling bookcases crammed with novels. He moved towards the shelves and ran his hand over the spines and read through the familiar and unfamiliar titles. Some of the books brought an involuntary smile to his face. The only resemblance her room held to the rest of the house, as Katie's aunt had said, was that it was meticulously clean. He knew that if Katie had fallen from the balcony on purpose, and cleaning her room had been some sort of message, or if she had left a note, he had to be the one to find it. He turned to the bookcase next to the window, his searching eyes were instantly drawn to the large, incongruent textbook sitting on the bottom shelf in the left-hand corner. He knelt down and slid the tome out from its tightly held position amongst the other large books. The cover read, "The Form of Fiction." It was his old college writing textbook, and he had given it to Katie as a graduation gift on her last day as his student the year before. He remembered the light in her eyes as he handed it to her, neatly wrapped. He recalled his own delight as she tore away the wrapping and looked down at the old, worn-out textbook, struggling not to let her confusion show across her happy demeanor. When she looked up at him with those bright green eyes, he'd asked, "You don't like it?" To which she'd replied with a poor attempt at gratitude and cheer, but that only sweetened his anticipation and made the surprise that much sweeter. "Open the cover," he'd instructed her, smiling widely. Remembering, Daniel opened the cover himself and read the inscription he'd written there. Water. Katie, as you step into a much larger world, I offer you this little secret. The reason most adults are so serious and severe and so ignorantly self-assured is not that they grow up and stop imagining, or that they forget how to play pretend, or that they someday discover some truth about life which is withheld from children. Actually, it's quite the contrary. Adults have become so adept, so masterful with their imaginings that they begin to believe in them themselves. But this is just another fiction. Now, of course, if you make any attempt to point this out to any dignified individual, they will no doubt deny it, because deep down they know it's all a sham, and they're terrified someone else will find out that they've been making it all up as they go along. At first glance, this might seem a shameful thing, the fact that we are all living elaborately constructed fictions, that we are so naive that we can actually get lost in the worlds we create for ourselves. But it is something we should all embrace, for it is where our true power as artists and creators resides. And even if you forget from time to time, even if you get lost in a world you make for yourself, you will always have a place to return, a refuge to help you remember. Katie, there is no safer place to bare your soul, or share your story, or hide your secrets, than where it is plain for all to see, within the boundless confines of fiction. Sincerely, Daniel Teely. Daniel closed his eyes, and his cheeks ran warm with fresh tears. He shook slightly, and his mouth quivered. Then he took in sharp, uneven breaths. He remembered her bright, wide smile and the way she looked at him. "That's amazing. Thank you so much," she'd said, her voice full of real appreciation. He'd shaken his head and replied, "That's not even the whole gift, silly. Turn the page." And she did. She did, revealing a square space cut out from the center of the pages of the book, leaving an empty hole. "I know you've had problems with your aunt looking through your things. Now you have a place to keep some things to yourself." Daniel turned the page himself. Within the emptied-out space there now sat a large stack of Polaroid pictures, held together with two crisscrossing rubber bands. He had to chuckle. Whereas most people took photos with their phones, Katie had a fascination with the texture and the graininess of older photography, and had bought herself a compact Polaroid camera, which took and developed instant photographs. Daniel was happy to see that the top photo of the stack was the picture Katie had taken of him on her graduation day. He rose from the floor and moved to sit on the edge of Katie's bed. Daniel undid the rubber bands and shifted the photo to the back of the stack, and beneath it was a photo of the young boy that he'd met at the hospital. It was a candid shot, the boy smiling shyly, standing outside at a park. Daniel felt a strange pang of jealousy at the presence of this young man being in the same stack of secret photos. It was silly, he knew, to expect Katie to have no other pictures of friends, or whatever the boy was. To her, he slid the picture of Caleb to the back as well. The next picture took him by surprise, though, as he wasn't quite sure what to make of it at first glance. Daniel's face flushed, and his stomach knotted as he took in the contents of the photo. It was a picture of Katie, with her naked breasts cupped in her hands and pressed together. She was not the one taking the picture. A swarm of arousal and jealousy churned in his chest, and a swarm of arousal and jealousy churned in his chest as he looked at the strange picture. It made him feel anxious and oddly sick. The thought crossed his mind that maybe he should just put the stack of Polaroids back in the book and leave them alone. Maybe they were never meant to be seen. But with the stack counting somewhere between 20 and 30 photos, his curiosity got the better of him. The next picture made Daniel's hand shake. It was Katie, but this time she was being penetrated from behind. There was a mark on her back, a tattoo between her shoulder blades of a thick gray circle with odd edges that was even hard to make out from the angle of the shot. The photo must have been taken within the last year, as she had not had the tattoo when they had been together. As he continued slowly through the photos, not wanting to continue, yet unable to stop himself, he realized each of these pictures of Katie had been taken by a different man. The pictures varied wildly in the amounts of sexual content. Some were relatively mild, some almost disturbingly graphic. Some were caught during sex acts, and some were clearly after the sex had ended. The men were never shown beyond their genitals or a hand, and it was clear by the shades of certain pubic hair that some of the men were much older. The other trend that became clear very quickly was that the farther into the stack Daniel got, the younger Katie was in the pictures. By about halfway into the pile, Katie had braces on. He wasn't sure how old she was when she'd worn braces, but it must have been before she was 17, which was the age she was when he had met her. Daniel felt sick and earnest now. How far back did these photos go? And who were these men? They were men, he could tell, by the hair on their arms and the legs, on their legs and genitals. And as he reached the end of the stack and arrived back at the picture of his own face, he sat stupefied for a long moment. He thought he had known Katie. He'd thought she had been open with him about her life and her secrets, but she'd never mentioned this. He took his own photo off the top and turned it over, and to his surprise and horror, he found a long paragraph of Katie's handwriting scrawled across the back, and the first words written there were, "Dear Daniel." And that marks the end of chapter 3. I hope you all enjoyed that. It's the first time I've done a reading of all 3 chapters. I know that I have a lot of work to do on these, and I know I have a lot of work to do on the rest of the book, but I'm really happy that I got this done and had this reading because it helped motivate me to actually organize some of these parts. A lot of my book is discordant, different scenes that I haven't really pieced together. Actually, let me take this tape off so we can. Yeah, here we go. There we go. So yeah, a lot of this book, I have most of it written out, but a lot of it is in scenes that are like two possible beginnings of a scene, leading into a third part, and so it's just going to be some more work before I get those all put together, and then the thing I'm doing now, I'm a little sore in my throat right now. So the thing I'm working on right now is actually just moving forward. I have a tendency to overdo chapters again and again and again until I feel like they're perfect, but then I end up changing something later on, and then I have to go back and rewrite the beginning so it doesn't work out anyways. So I'm just going to keep moving on from this point. So it feels good to have the first 3 chapters done, even though they're definitely still in rough draft form. Yeah, so I hope you guys like it. I've been putting a lot of work into it, and yeah, that's all. Thanks.